Hey, welcome to Lab the Podcast. I am grateful to share some time with Matthew Clark. Matthew is a singer, songwriter, and author from Mississippi. The Well Trilogy is Matthew's most recently completed project. 3 full-length albums, each with a companion book of 13 essays written by a variety of contributors, exploring themes around encountering Jesus, faith-keeping, and the return of Christ. Matthew also hosts a weekly podcast, 1,000 Words, Stories on the Way, featuring essays reflecting on faith-keeping. He's a touring musician and a speaker. He travels sharing songs and stories. That's where I met him, at some mutual friends' home, and got to experience his art firsthand. Whether it's song, podcast, meal, or essay, he loves to make things that make room for people to meet Jesus. So Matthew, thank you so much for giving us a second opportunity for the conversation. I enjoyed our time the other night, but this is awesome.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it's good. We've been waiting for a while. I mentioned we had an invitation through some mutual friends to share some time at a house concert. You were coming through Florida, playing some shows, and that's where I was first introduced to you. And it's one of those magical contexts. I love intimate shows like that, where you have a chance to really get to know an artist. And that night, I was so excited. I thought, I can't wait to do this and have this conversation. I had not yet read your books. And so I'm even more excited to get into all of the projects. But Mississippi is home. That's where you're currently at?
That's where I currently am. That's where I grew up. Yeah, I live about an hour and a half away from where I grew up, where my parents still live.
Yeah, that's remarkable. I don't know how many people, maybe Riley can say that. Riley, our producer, he can say that, but not many people. I literally live on the other side of the country from where I
Uh,
was born. Was there ever a period in your life where you wanted out and you just said, like, get me as far from Mississippi as you can possibly get me? Or has it been so deeply home that you just felt like no place will ever be home?
yeah, there have definitely been times when I wanted out or wanted to move away. I grew up in a very small town, and there weren't a lot of opportunities artistically, and so that was challenging for sure. And then I did live in Memphis for a little while, and I lived in Oxford, Mississippi for a lot of years. But I think being a traveling musician has satisfied some of that itch for me. I've gotten to travel all over the country and make a lot of friends, and so I get to do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sure like the touring part does help make you desire a sense of home and all the familiarity, all the smells and the sights and the familiar roads and all of that would feel probably extra good when you spend long moments away. Growing
Yeah.
up, Mississippi was not maybe an ecosystem with a ton of artists. I heard you say that a second ago, but can you remember a moment growing up where you were aware of the beauty of Mississippi in kind of you saw through that artistic lens? And where would you be looking if you were like, yeah, no, as an artist, this river or this landscape in Mississippi is just some of the most beautiful parts of where I grew up?
Well, Mississippi is beautiful. It's very rural. There are not a lot of really big cities. But I would say most of that was unconscious. Yeah, I was surrounded by a lot of beauty, and I was absorbing, and I didn't know it. I wasn't aware of that per se. It's really in hindsight I look back and I think I grew up on 25 acres outside of town on this plot of land that had been in my family for 100 years, and I just played in the woods all day. And we had a farm, and we used to go out, and my dad was a deer hunter, and so he taught me how to sit for 3 hours perfectly still when the sun comes up and the birds are waking up and the world is coming to life. And I didn't know that I was being sort of saturated in a lot of really beautiful things, but I was, and I feel like the Lord gave me those gifts that I didn't know to even ask for, and they've really impacted me.
Yeah, I love Charles Taylor wrote A Secular Age and talks about the buffered self versus the porous self. And
Mm-hmm.
I remember reading that and just having that language for how porous we really are, and how the places and the people that we are around, they do shape us. The spiritual realities, we're being shaped and formed. Those things are coming in. And sometimes we have the idea that we can keep all that stuff out, but Mississippi's in you. There's a part of Mississippi
Yeah.
that is just part of who you are, which I
Mm-hmm.
think for sure influences you as an artist. At, at what point in that story did all that beauty that was kind of coming into you start to
Mm-hmm.
become expressed out of you in a way that you knew that you had a gift for storytelling and singing and songwriting?
It took a little while for me to, I mean, I was playing music from around 11 or 12. Um, and there are a couple of things I should also mention. Is my mom played guitar and sang. So she had a nylon string guitar, and she was into a lot of the 60s folk stuff, and she was singing those kinds of things from a very early age, and she was also a reader and came from a reading family. And so she was reading stories, like reading Lord of the Rings to me at bedtime when I was too young to put myself to bed. So I had a lot of exposure. She's also an artist, and a ceramic artist, and she loves to travel. So from a young age, by the time I graduated high school, I had been to England and France and Italy and Spain. I'd been to England and France probably 3 times, something like that, and seen cathedrals and museums and great works of art. So even though I came from this little place in Mississippi, the Lord really provided in a lot of ways for me to have exposure to these things. But it was probably not really until late in college that I started kind of thinking about actually making things myself, making songs, making art, or and then it was even later, really in my mid 30s, I was writing. I was writing, but I didn't have the ability to see myself as a writer until my friend Lancia Smith really was a mentor to me and a friend, called that out of me. She read something I wrote, and she said, "Well, what did you write this essay for? It's this long essay that I wrote." I was like, "I just wrote it for fun." And she's like, "You wrote you wrote it for fun?" I was like, "Yeah, I have a folder just full of essays on my Google Drive that aren't for anything. They're just I just like doing that." And she was like, "You might be a writer."
Yeah, I think that's a great first, just whoever it is, whether it's a friend or a parent, calling those things out. I love how you said that. That calling, a vocation is literally a calling, and vocare, the idea of a calling. And sometimes we're unaware of our calling. It takes a while for us to
Sure.
find our way to having language for our calling. And sometimes a good friend literally calls it out of us and says, I
Yeah.
think you're called to this. How would you describe your calling, your vocation? Is that, do you feel like writer first or
Mm.
essayist? How would you put language to maybe what you're called to? And I think there's that, your vocation and your occupation kind of blur the lines a little bit there. What you've given your life to an occupation that's very aligned, it seems, with your vocation. But start with vocation. Like, how would you describe your calling?
Yeah. Well, there are a few things I think about. One is talking about having someone call that out. We can talk later about the idea of the face and being able to see yourself, because really you need other people to see you in order to be able to see yourself. And so that's what happened with Lancia. We need help, people to help us identify those things. But there's an image that comes to mind for me with regard to calling, and there's been a long, very slow process in my life, and maybe that's my fault or maybe it's normal, but it it took a very long time for me to get some bearings, and understand this. But for me, there's this image of like a gardening image where you have this bulb, um, this bulb that's like for a rose bush or something, and that thing is underground. You can't even see it. And then is going to send up sprouts, and it's going to become this shrub, and the shrub is going to produce too many buds, more buds than it can sustain. And so you're going to come in and you're going to prune some of those so that the shrub can really go crazy on these 4 or 5 things. But underground is kind of the central vocation, the central calling or identity marker. And so for me, eventually what I came to was saying that core identity thing that's underground, that everything else comes out of, is not playing guitar or writing or playing concerts, or it's not actually any of those things. Those are the buds on the bush. Those are the ways this thing can work out, and those can actually change. If I damaged my hand and I couldn't play guitar, I could still be who God made me to be. So what is that thing underground? That thing underground is something, for me at least, like hospitality. Mm. So it's more of a posture or a way of approaching life. And for me, that's why if you go on my website, my mission statement is, and you read it at the beginning, is to make things that make room for people to meet Jesus. And so the things are kind of like the buds on the shrub, but making room, there's an act of hospitality that's really central to the way I understand myself and what I'm meant to do in the world, which is to make things like songs and books and podcasts and concerts. And those become little habitats where the conditions are such that certain kinds of interactions are more likely to happen. And hopefully that means that people can meet Jesus. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, no, it does. Beautifully, beautifully said. And I think even more potent for me, having experienced you making room in our mutual friend's home, is that is your gift. That is your calling. I watched it. I experienced the power of you just being willing to participate with what God's called you to do and who he's made you to be. And it did make room. I remember the impact even for me, hearing some very familiar stories from the Gospels that night, things that we're well familiar with, and we've traveled around those stories, and those stories have impacted them. But that night there was room for them to be really fresh and for us to encounter them in a really beautiful way. I think that's so. If you're listening to the episode, go back and listen to that description. What a beautiful description of identifying. So many of us ask the question because it does take a long time. I don't think we just, in our adolescent years, go, oh, I can identify the bulb underneath that contains all the things for but we don't have language for that. It takes a long time. So go back and listen to that. That's beautifully said. And that idea of making room is through the things that you make: songs, essays, hospitality environments. What I experienced with you or through you and this project was exactly that. And it's cool to hear you say that, because this trilogy that you have is the recent project of yours. It's not just one thing. There are stories, there are songs, there is a way that this interacts with other artists in a really beautiful way. So tell us about the Well Trilogy. And if you could, if somebody just said, so is it a book? Is it an album? You kind of asked that question well, but I've got the book part in my hands here. But if you were to introduce the Well Trilogy, how would you describe how you have made room through this project?
Right. Well, the first part of that is kind of what is it? And as for me, music was kind of first for me, and then writing came second, or longer form essay writing. And this really combines both of those things. Obviously, a song is this really concentrated, focused point of communication or means of communication. But there's always a feeling of like, oh, but it would be fun to have a conversation around this song. And I want to say so much more than just sing this song. And one of the funny ideas was I just missed something like liner notes. How you used to have a physical album and you'd open it up and you'd read the liner notes and you'd see the pictures and it was just so fun and you had this tangible thing you could hold. And now that music is streaming, all that feels like it's just missing. There's this tangible absence. And I thought, what if I could make something that would go with the albums that you could recover some of that. And then that just opened up into this idea of, well, what if I know a lot of amazing writers. What if I asked those amazing writers to pick a song off of this album and then not critique or analyze the song, but actually enter into a conversation with these themes and these images and write a personal kind of narrative reflection that it could build out into a book that could go with these songs. So really the songs and the albums are, to me, in my mind, they're inseparable. They're the same thing. You just have sort of narrative component to the songs, or a song component to the narrative. And then another aspect of the project as a whole was I was reading, I'm a big Tolkien and Lewis fan, a big Inklings fan, and Diana Glyer is an Inklings scholar, and her big argument is kind of proving how crucial collaboration was for Tolkien and Lewis, that they never would have written the things that they wrote had it not been for their friendship and the way they influenced each other. And I thought I was experiencing, or God was really teaching me, that I was too much of a loner, and that something I needed to learn was how to collaborate better. So I thought, well, the best way I know to learn something is to kind of get myself in trouble, to get myself into a situation where I have to do the thing that I don't normally do, right? So I thought, if I create this project, that will set me up. It'll force me to practice this thing that I don't know how to do very well. And so it was also kind of a personal growth project in that respect. But it ended up being just beautiful to be able to collaborate with all these people, and for the whole thing not just to be my voice, because I also wanted to be surprised. I wanted to learn. And if everything is coming from me, then nothing surprises me and I don't learn anything necessarily,
Yeah. I love how you described just a recovery of something that was a part of you and I's experience growing up. I grew up listening to albums, and so that was childhood, was vinyls, and you would open the vinyls and you did have a jacket, and there was interior art, and there was all sorts of things that the artists had curated in that. Move on to like adolescent years, grew up on tapes, tape decks, and the same thing. You would unfold that tape cover and it just would fold and fold and fold out, right? And whether it was Bruce Springsteen's tapes or whatever, you're just like, it was such joy to go actually purchase a cassette tape and then get home and open that thing and then see what the artist had curated inside that. And then it turned, CDs came, and the same thing, those CDs, you would open them up and it was fun because the artistic project wasn't, one medium or one dimensional. It was an entire experience. And I think just like hospitality, a feast, we have forgotten. Poetry's a way of remembering what it would impoverish us to forget. That's a Frost line. And I think in so many ways we don't understand how impoverished we are when digital streaming is the only medium, or it's the most accessible medium for us to consume music. That's how we're fed and brought up. We think that's normal. It's like microwave dinners. And then you go to a house concert with an actual artist who's living and in the flesh. And then they have written and they have essays curated around these songs and thoughts from these songs. And all of a sudden you're a feast. In fact, the scholar that you just mentioned has a note on your book that says it's both feast and fellowship. And I love that there is something so much richer that needs to be recovered. So I love that you have done that intentionally in this project. And for everybody listening, I would say we'll put the links up, but the Well Trilogy, it's a collection of essays and writings and song lyrics and the songs that are the companions to those. It is a feast and a fellowship and a friendship with artists. And Matthew, you talk about patronage being kind of the place where this project was even birthed. You had somebody made room for you, and it
Yeah.
allowed you to bring this project to life. Take us back to that place where you started creating and making, because I think the other thing we do is we, on the other end of art, sometimes it's neatly bound and the cover art is well curated and everything feels great. And sometimes we're surprised. I was surprised when I opened this and I dove into the first chapters. I was like, I did not think that was where this story was going to start, right? And
Yeah.
so take us back, if you can, just to introduce somebody to the origin of this project. It wasn't like you got a $300,000 advance and somebody put you up in London to write for a bit. And you were just like, what am I going to write about? Let me just take this Well series. This was from a different place. Take us back to that place.
It really was. I'm a big believer that the phrase for me is the making makes us. The making makes us. And that part of the reason that we're invited both as artists to make art and as people who are enjoying art to participate in it and enter into it is because it actually does something. It changes something in us. And so I know that when I make a song or a book or I write an essay, it's not because I've fully arrived at something. It's because I'm reaching and I'm trying to learn and listen. And it's very much a listening and a growth process. And that was very true for this whole project that took 6 or 7 years, but that had really come out of 6 or 7 years prior to that of really intense grief and loss after a divorce. And that just shook my whole world, just kind of blew my life apart. And the sort of trauma and the disorientation that came from that experience, the Lord took me through very slowly through these processes of healing. But one of the main ways that he did that was he just almost grabbed my head and just said, look at this story in John chapter 4. I want you to just watch the woman at the well and don't take your eyes off her because you've got something to learn from her.
Mm.
And so I just couldn't get away from that story for about 5 years. It just kept coming around all the time. Just seemed like everywhere I looked, that story would come up, and I started paying attention. And it became it became a little habitat. It became a little place of hospitality that the Lord had curated. And he had John, the gospel writer, curate so that I could meet him in that place. So even God was kind of doing that same thing that I hope to do for me. And I watched Jesus interact with this woman whose life was so full of trauma and tragedy that her imagination for any good thing out in front of her was totally obliterated, just burned out imagination. And then Jesus goes out of his way to go looking for her, to surprise her with the fact that he actually wants to be with her and wants to make her, wants to essentially marry her. She sort of represents all of us. The bride of Christ she's a real person. This really happened. But she also becomes this sort of placeholder for all of us because we're all the wrong woman in every way. Jesus comes looking for us saying, you can stop drinking from all of those other wells that are just making you thirsty over and over again. What you need is a Sabbath husband. You need living water, and I'm the only one that can give that to you. And I want to give that to you. I'm happy to give that to you. And so Jesus broke through to me via that story and began to give me a new imagination for life that it might not be over. Maybe there was actually hope out in front of me that I couldn't feel or sense. And then that led to beginning to write songs about that, and beginning to write essays, trying to work out those things that I was learning. And then that eventually turned into, I need some other people with me. And then it turned into this project, which was very much emerging from that healing process for me.
Yeah. There's so many things that I want to ask you in that, because I'm imagining. Thank you, by the way, for being willing to share that and just open up from that, right? Because our automatic assumption all the time is that everybody else's life has it all put together, and we're struggling behind the scenes. And if you only knew me, you'd know this. And when somebody says, "Hey, this I didn't have it all sewn up at the time that this project was coming together. It's really coming out of or through this other place." We get to kind of take a breath and go, "Oh, you too." And friendship is
Yeah.
born in that place.
Mhm.
So thank you for that. And you know, coming from a season where your life had an orientation and now it's totally disoriented and something new has not yet emerged, that's a scary, scary place. And I imagine there's people listening who have been through that, are going through that. How did you know that God was trying to ask you to pay attention to this particular story? Because I found that really fascinating. You said I thought about this story for 5 years. I think that's, again, we could just have a whole podcast conversation on the fact that we've again lost not just cover art for albums and multidisciplinary ways of encountering art, but we've lost the ability to sit with a story for 5 years. Like nobody does that. How did you first of all start to pick up that hint, or how did you become aware that God was saying, pay attention to this story? And I'm thinking of that person listening to this going, I wonder if that's happening to me, right? Like there's something keeps
Mhm.
coming through. There's a theme that keeps coming through. How did you become aware that, like, you think God wakes you up a couple times in the night and finally it's like, oh, wait, you're talking to me, God. So how did you become aware of that?
Speak, Lord. I'm listening.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was a funny experience, because it wasn't some great piety of mine. It really was that it just kept showing up. It just kept, like, it would show up in a podcast, and 2 weeks later, it'd be in the sermon at church, and then it'd run across it in a book. It just kept bubbling up, and I really had the feeling like this story is pursuing me. This thing is just coming after me,
Mm,
um, and the more that happened, and then I began to look at it, and then it started to really grip me. It started to fascinate me, and I started to see, like, oh, there's more going on here than I ever realized. Um, and then also, just, I think there's some kind of um, resonance that started to form, that I can't really put into words or communicate via just information. It was like I just felt like this woman got me.
mm, mhm,
I just felt like, oh, I understand
mm.
something. There's just some kind of uh, we're in the same place. She knows what I'm going through,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
And
And
mhm.
yeah, you said in the book, I wished that I could have had a John 9 story be the one that resonates.
Yeah.
What did you mean by that? Like here's this story keeps coming up, keeps coming up. This woman gets me. And you wrote just a little bit after that, like, I wished it could have been John 9. Why couldn't it have been John 9? What'd you mean?
Well, John 9 is the man born blind, right? And the disciples are like, "Oh, what did this guy do?" And Jesus is like, "Nothing. He didn't do anything wrong. This is it." And I was like, "Oh, that would have been nice to hear." But, part of what I had to admit is that not everything was my fault, but some of it was.
Mm,
And I've got to be honest. Part of the difficulty in the woman at the well story is that um, it's so painful to face ourselves. And I don't think we can have the courage to face ourselves unless we know that somebody is glad to be with us.
Mm.
And so, um, but it's also true that it's not all her fault. She is also in a cultural uh, situation where she has been abused, she has been taken advantage of, she's probably been cast off. So not everything is her fault, and I go into that in the book. How there's a lot of nuance to that, and it's a complicated situation. Um, and that was true for me. Not everything was somebody else's fault, and I had to look at myself too. But I would have liked to have had a simpler,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
scenario in that sense.
Well, I appreciated how you said that. And I think many of us, I can think of a lot of people just coming to mind where we go, man, I wish God was teaching me or calling me to a different thing. And yet you read scripture and you're like, hey, this person's story, Hosea had this story and Abraham had this story. And as he's walking up a mountain, the particular thing he has to face is one thing. And so we all have that. And I love scripture because we do meet this cast of characters where we go, oh, you too, and I'm not
Right.
alone. And God
Yeah.
was there in this person's moment. We can meet these friends along the way that we see how God was at work and their life does resonate. So just, you know, if you are going through one of those seasons, I would say pay attention to scripture. I mean, just listen to what Matthew is saying. There was some story there that was living and active and it came up and there was resonance and it keeps coming up. And if that's happening to you, pay attention. So, Matthew, the trilogy starts exploring themes around encountering Jesus. So you really have John 4, there's the encounter, and then the arc of the story moves across the trilogy to faith keeping. What do you mean by that?
Mhm.
That term faith keeping.
Yeah, yeah. Well, what the Hebrews definition talks about faith being, being certain of things that you can't see. And Abraham, they were waiting for this city, and these, the kind of hall of faith in Hebrews 11, but they didn't actually get the thing that they were hoping for. There's a great joy set before them, but they haven't gotten there yet. We're waiting. So there's this kind of mean time where we're in this middle where we've got to hang in there. And in the first book, in the first album, it's all about being surprised that Jesus actually loves you and wants to be with you.
Mm.
And you just thought, oh, if he showed up, the look on his face would be disgust. It would have to be. And then you get this surprise that the look on his face is not disgust. It's actually delight. He's glad to be with us. And Jim Wilder says the definition of joy is not the removal of pain. It's finding out someone is glad to be with us
Mm.
wherever we are. And so we see in his face what we mean to him, and that changes the way we see ourselves. But then the second book is all about what comes next, what comes after that. Maybe that's a mountaintop experience, but then you have to come down off the mountaintop and you got to figure out, okay, all of my problems didn't magically disappear. I've still got a real life to live. I've still got to deal with, whatever these things are. The things that traumatize or grieve us, grief is not a process that removes that thing from our lives. It's a long process of learning to live with it and in relationship to it in a different way, knowing that God is with us. So we still have to live by faith and kind of work out those processes with fear and trembling, right? Knowing that God is glad to be with us. So this middle book is also about, you're going to have a lot of voices that are going to say, come over here, come over here. And the voice of God is going to be saying, no, 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 come over here and abide in me and the way I do things.
Mm.
And you're always going to have to choose between the family tree of evil or the family tree of God.
Mm.
Which tree am I going to root myself in so that the way I understand how life actually works and the way I see the world is being informed by this outlandish perspective of the one who came from heaven, or otherwise, and so you have to live in that tension and be constantly making that choice.
Mm.
you know
Yeah, I love just the way that you put faith keeping, and faith is a gift from God. So in some ways, like it's gift, like even our faith, we receive this thing, but there's a keeping aspect to it, and we do keep that fire stoked and warm and go. We don't have to think about that in Florida as much, but when I lived back in Oregon, right, like you had to tend that thing, and there were
Yeah,
ways to tend
because
that
it's a
thing.
relationship.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, it's because it's relationship. Relationships require maintenance.
yeah.
And maintenance has to do with hands. Your in French, hands are mains, right? Mains. And so maintenance has to do with hands and contact and maintaining contact. And that's also the same word we get apprehension.
Mm-hmm.
That's also the same word we get apprentice. And an apprentice learns from the master because he keeps contact. He keeps touching the master. And so all relationships work that way. So faith keeping is really a relational term. Jesus, I want to stay attached to you as deeply as possible and aware. I want to keep that face before me that I met at Jacob's well. That's the only thing that's going to get me through.
Mm-hmm.
And then the last book is very much about that, the ultimate trajectory of moving toward that face, which is classically been called the beatific vision,
Yeah.
right? To finally have every veil removed and to have this meeting face to face with God Himself. And when you see Him seeing you, you will finally become all that He ever dreamt for you to be. And that will be God's dream for you will be realized completely. We're on the way to that now.
Yeah. Yeah, that vision is Jesus theme has been central to our work at V3, that the vision is Jesus and that we're longing, and there's a now reality to that and a longing for that when everything that kind of veils that has been fully removed, and we see not just with faith but sight, and we long for it. That Martin Buber's somebody who wrote a book called I Thou, and in that, I think he has the line, "Secretly and bashfully we wait for someone else to confirm the thou in us." And
Oh,
what a beautiful line, right? And he's talking about this recognition that we get as people, that we do wait for that, and maybe there's that waiting long term in that moment where we see Christ and we see that well done. There's that confirmation of who we are and who He is. But I have heard you a couple times now talk about. I listened to a lecture you gave, and then in the living room where we were I heard you describe that encountering not just of the face of God, but of the face of another person.
mm-hmm.
And you do that. You described it well. You know, Lewis would say in The Weight of Glory that if we really saw someone for who they are, that we would be, tempted to fall down and worship them, and
Mm-hmm.
just because of the magnificence of this creature. And you in a lecture said that there is a sense in us that almost when we do have that recognition of someone's face, we have an impulse to bow, that there's something that's coming through the face. And I just heard you note that even a second ago. Would you say more about that? Because I took so much away from just what you're describing in the human person and the face of another person.
Yeah, and the epilogue to the first book goes into depth about a lot of those ideas. Um, well, something I always say in concerts, and it's kind of fun to ask people, is like I say, "Where are your eyeballs?" And but the idea is like the way your face is built is your face faces away from your face. so so your face is not built in such a way to allow you to see yourself. And so in some sense your face doesn't exist for you, it exists for someone else.
Mm.
And you have an opportunity to give your face, to make your face shine on someone else so that they can see themselves being seen and therefore find out what they look like. So I don't know what I look like. How do I know? I know because I look at your face looking at mine. And if you're glad to see me, then I know, oh, it's good that I exist.
Mm.
It's good that I exist. And there's one of my favorite, a friend of mine and a favorite, she's an epistemologist, Esther Lightcap Meek, wrote a little book called The Mother's Smile.
Mm.
And it's all about how if God's design goes just the way it's supposed to go, every single human being arrives on planet Earth, and the very first thing they see is about 6 or 8 inches away from their face is the shining face of mom. And she says that is God's design to welcome you into the world so that somebody is smiling at you saying, it is so good that you exist. And that sets the trajectory for you to discover that same thing, to expect that same thing, and to be looking for that same thing
Mm,
from God ultimately. That sets you on
mm,
course. It lays the
mm,
tracks
mm,
for the beatific vision, because ultimately that is what you were made for, is to stand face to face with God and for him to make the light of his face to shine upon you. And that's the only way you find out what you actually mean
wow.
and who you actually are and what your name actually consists of. Is your name actually consists of God's joy. If you think about even the way humans ideally are meant to come into the world, it's when it's this union of great love and joy and celebration, and out of that should be where people come from,
Mm,
right? And so um, the world is sort of designed with as that as the trajectory.
yeah, it's beautiful. I think I'll get it wrong, but you said something akin to the face is the epicenter of the epiphany of the spirit in the material life, and that there's the
Yeah.
what a potent way to describe that. And so thank you for going back. It triggered in my mind. There's a psychologist named Bruno Bettelheim who wrote a book. And I think I was reading it as a parent, trying to figure out how to do parenting well. And I was convicted this is not like an affirmation of everything Bettelheim would have said psychologically. But I am going to say this. He was describing like the face of a parent when you're changing your child's diaper. And he
Oh,
said, think about how powerful that facial recognition is if we learn that we're disgusting
oh wow.
in something that we have no control over. And every
Mm-hmm.
time our adult caregiver looks at us, they are disgusted in their face. And we didn't do anything wrong. We were just doing what we do as children. And that
Yeah.
chapter like set my mind ablaze with things to
Wow.
think about. But I mean, I heard that voice coming back through of just how careless we are with our recognition and how we secretly and bashfully wait for somebody to confirm the thou in us, that we're waiting for somebody to say it's good that you exist. I remembered you saying that night and just feeling like, man, what a conviction for our calling in the world to look and see the thou in another person.
Mm-hmm.
And how powerful that is, because the voice in our head over and over says we are disgusting, we don't belong, we're not here. What would you say to the person who says, Matthew, I hear you, and there's this beautiful thing coming through you that God looks at us and says it's good that you exist? What would you say to the person that said that might be true for everybody else,
Mm.
but I am disgusting. And if you really did know my story, it is disgusting. And there's no way that God could look at me and say it's good that you exist. What would you say to the person who actually feels that? Because those voices can get so loud and so cemented that we can
Yeah.
hear and kind of pull up next to a conversation like this and we go, I wish that were true. And that might be true for the two of you. But if you saw me, and particularly if God looked at me, this is who I really am. And I am
Mm-hmm.
disgusting. What do you say to that person from your kind of Christian theological perspective?
Yeah. Well, there are a lot of things you can say. I think that one of the problems with one of the problems with mere information is that usually something like that is, if someone has gotten to a point where they feel that in such an entrenched, deep, saturated way because of certain life experiences, just telling them is probably not going to be able to get down to where the real problems are, because it's probably not a problem of information. It's something more like a problem of relational experience. And that's one of the reasons why I really believe in the arts, because the arts are not making a primarily informational approach. They are making a more of an affective approach, which is something more similar to relationality and the experience of relationality. There have been studies about people who, brain studies about people who read stories, really good writing, and they said your brain is doing the same thing as you read about this relational experience as it would be if you were actually having the relational experience. So it's not approaching as just an argument or data. It's actually giving you something like a relational reality to go through and feel. Because what ultimately has to change if somebody's in a place like that, they might need some information, but they're going to need they're going to need to actually just feel what it feels like for someone to enjoy them and love them and like to be around them. I think that's what a lot of what this faith stuff is about is Jesus. It was nonverbal, By the end of that conversation, whatever changed for the woman at the well was not that Jesus said the magic words. It's that he was himself in his flesh, that word. And he gave her that word through his presence and his tone and his face and the way he looked at her, so many different things. So there's not a quick answer. I wish there was a really quick answer, like you can just say this and they'll be fine. And you can flip that little switch. I don't think we can. I don't think it works that way. And so we've got to be really patient with people and really stick with loving them.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's such a good invitation into relationship. And I think that's ultimately why the invitation that Jesus makes is come to me, like come directly to me. And that we have the ability to say, I can't really say anything to you to heal that, but I can encourage you to allow this one that has come to meet you at that well to turn his face to you. And I can tell you that he did to me. And
Yeah.
that maybe is the best that we can do. And ultimately to have that encounter with Jesus is the starting point to that life that does have the strength in it to keep faith and ultimately to see with not just faith, with sight. So Matthew, thank you just for the way that you have curated this project. I mean, I want to just honor the fact that 6 or 7 years of an endeavor to collect and to curate and to think collaboratively with that Inklings approach to bring artists together. This project is beautiful and it's in every way. The music is beautiful. The writing is extraordinarily beautiful. And the way that you have invited us to come and move all the way through that story is really, really beautiful. So the trilogy is the Well Trilogy, Matthew Clark. I know, Matthew, that people can find you and your essays and your work. I know I want to be careful of your time, but if people, after hearing this, just say, okay, so what's next? I want to get the book, obviously, follow your music. Where can people connect with you as an artist? And then are you doing more house shows or are there things like that coming up? Are they in the works?
Yeah, the best, most easy place is just my website, which is matthewclark.net. Matthewclark.net. And from there, you can link to Spotify. All of the music is on Spotify, every streaming platform. I have a YouTube channel you can find the podcast on there. It's also on Apple and Spotify. And you can kind of get to all the things from my website. And I'm on Instagram as well. But yeah, I'm sort of plotting the fall to work out some touring. I'll probably be touring more and looking for people to host concerts in kind of the around Philly, kind of northeast area during maybe September and October, maybe some in August. So I'll be more on that side of the country, but I'll be looking for concerts to be out on the road and sharing songs and stories.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you for visiting us down here. And
Yeah.
for everybody listening, Matthew Clark's a good friend in that storytelling gift that he will invite you into places that will surprise you. I know that for me, I've turned some pages and found some relief and some rest in some things that I've been wrestling with just from the way that he writes and asks you to maybe consider things that are maybe even familiar to you. So I highly recommend the Well Trilogy. Go find Matthew if he's in your city. And Matthew, maybe when it gets cold, V3 will have a little opportunity to bring you back down this way, and we'll get to hang out again in person. But until then, thank you for your work and for all the great writing. We need it in culture, but you've done a really masterful job. This is beautiful.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. It's great to be with you.
Yeah, take care.